So, one of the points that I want to make with all of that is to say that kinship is universal. Every single society has a way of figuring out who's related to who. It's also super important, as we've just seen. Having said that and having acknowledged that, the forms that families take vary dramatically across cultures. That's not to say that the basic structure isn't there in every culture. Every culture has some version of sort of two spouses and kiddos, right? And that's very, very common. And indeed, although many societies allow polygamous marriages, we would still say that statistically speaking, the most common form of marriage across the almost 8 billion human beings that we have is monogamous marriages, typically with children. So there's that idea of sort of what we think of in the US as a nuclear family is very common across cultures. But the bigger question is sort of where do you go from there, right? Societies don't end relatives there. Instead, societies have a much bigger webs of sort of who's related to who, and even within the more immediate family, what the relationships are between the different members. So let's talk about some of those variations. So first of all, you have nuclear family, right? The idea that what your book calls your family of procreation. And you might ask yourself, so the idea of a nuclear family, the idea of sort of two parents who may or may not be together, and then children, where would you expect it to be emphasized? And where would you expect it not to be emphasized? Or rather, I should say, where would you expect extended families to be emphasized? Because many societies place a lot of emphasis, yeah, sure, on the nuclear family, but especially on the extended family, right? And potentially you have multiple generations living in the same home, as would have been the case traditionally, for example, in the Aleutian Islands with Unangan or Aleut people. Traditionally, those would have been multi-generational homes. And so in many societies, you have extended family being really heavily emphasized, and in others, it's really nuclear family focused. So where would you expect more of one or the other? Well, to answer that question, let me give you a little history lesson. Even in the United States, which we tend to think of as tending to be more nuclear family oriented, although there's different subcultures that are more extended family oriented, even in the US where we tend to more often live just with a nuclear family and kind of place a lot of our focus there and potentially live, hundreds of miles away from our extended family, if you look historically, that wasn't always the case. If you look at very early America, kind of colonial America, and then like the, 1776 through about 1850, it was very, very common for people to live in very close proximity to their cousins, to their grandparents, have either multi-generational homes or at the very least sort of multi-generational compounds where you had sort of several homes clustered together, and for people to sort of be farming with their dad even as an adult, right? And their kid be farming with them as well. It was with the Industrial Revolution, really, that the idea of nuclear families started to really take off. And indeed, that's what we see across the world, is that societies were nuclear. This is not always the case, but it is the case in many industrialized societies that nuclear family are really what's strongly emphasized. We talked before about how Italy tends to be more extended family oriented, which might help explain some of the rapid early transmission of COVID, sadly, within Italy. But generally speaking, industrialized nations tend to be a lot more nuclear family oriented. Why would that be so? Use your thinking cap and try to think of a hypothesis. Why would that be so? Well, one way to think about that is what changes when a society becomes industrialized, and one of the answers is it becomes even more specialized in terms of the different jobs people do. Farming becomes something that only a few people do, and suddenly most people have specialized kind of jobs and they move to cities where they have specialized jobs. And think about what you're going into. Let's say you're going into speech therapy, and let's say that in your tiny town, they don't need a speech therapist. They've already got a speech therapist. What are you going to do? Maybe you move to Anchorage. Maybe you move to Fairbanks. Maybe you move to Kenai. You're going to move to a bigger city potentially, right? Or if you can't find work doing speech therapy in one of these cities, maybe you go to the lower 48 or maybe you go to Canada. Now multiply that by millions, because that's essentially what faces most Americans, right? Most Americans, when they get their jobs are very specialized. And so there may be openings in your home community and there may not. So it no longer makes sense in an economy that's highly specialized. It no longer makes sense to do something like what Hopi society traditionally did and kind of insist that the married couple come and live with the extended family and stay there and stay on that land, right? Now for economic survival in an industrialized society, people need to move around and go to wherever the work is. And, that only gets kind of heightened in recent decades with a much more precarious economy even than our parents experienced, where it's much more likely that you'll have to potentially, A, change jobs and B, potentially just change entire locations of the United States or even world to find different jobs that are best for you. So industrialization tends to lead to more of a focus on nuclear families versus extended families. All right, well, so that's one way of family, that there can be variation across cultures, is family structure. Another is family roles. So this is a picture of some Trobriand Island people doing a ceremony, and then this is the Trobriand Islands, which are close to Papua New Guinea, which is close to Australia. Now, in the Trobriand Islands, you have a matrilineal kinship system. So if you're a child, your property, your name, your identity really comes through your mother's line rather than your father's line. The U.S. is what we call bilineal or unilineal, with kind of patrilineal slight leaning, in the sense that it is common, although not universal, for people to take their father's last name, but really you can inherit things from both your father and your mother, and you kind of have more of a mixed system. And for that matter, we don't typically, inherit property from our parents unless you're like, I don't know, the upper middle class or upper class, right? Or at least not extensive property. By contrast, in many societies, you might be inheriting land, religious objects, all sorts of things, identities, and so you have to have a way to trace that. And in the Trobriand Islands, that's done through the female line, so mothers to their children. Matrilineal is what we call that. Now, in the Trobriand Islands, what's interesting is another thing that kind of often goes with being matrilineal, which is that a really, really important figure in a young person's life is actually their mother's brother. So their uncle on their mom's side, who ends up filling a role that looks very much like dads, quote unquote, in American culture, in the sense that they will be kind of your mentor, your trainer, teach you the kind of family business, so to speak, the craft that you're taking on, particularly if it's a male child, and kind of be really, really actively involved. In contrast to fathers in Trobriand Island, who can often kind of take on almost a role equivalent to like the fun uncle in American society, in the sense that they're important and they're still the dad, of course, of the kid, but they kind of take on a role more as the fun parent, right? The indulgent one. And so in a way, although, yes, the mother and the father are recognized as married by the society, unless there's been a divorce or a separation, the mother and the mother's brother are kind of the more important dyad in the child's life, the more important couple in a sense, although they're not a romantic couple. So, interesting variation. So let's talk now briefly about descent. As I was just saying, there's different ways that societies regard descent, but unless you're, living in medieval England or something, or if you're, one of the Kennedys or something, descent groups are not as important in the United States. It's not that people don't care about who they're descended from, but as far as like a organization that works together, passing property down amidst each other, often taking on political and religious functions together, that's not too common in the United States. We took a pretty sharp break from that back during the colonial era, in fact. By contrast, in many societies, lineage groups become so prominent that we sometimes call them corporate groups. Like they act, like a corporation kind of. That's not really the root of the word, but that's kind of the idea. They act like this group that moves and works together. So for example, within China, specifically among Han people, which is one of the ethnic groups, and in fact the majority ethnic group within China, you have a patrilineal and patrilocal system where things get passed down through the male line, and it's very important to honor your father, and it's very important to honor your grandfather, and in fact it's very important to honor your deceased male relatives, and that's why you have these ancestral tablets that record genealogies and allow you to remember those past beings, and in fact you're supposed to provide for them in the afterlife, in the spirit world, and make sure that they're well by doing things like burning paper money or making rice offerings. But that only works if they're remembered. So the religious system, there's multiple different things. Chinese religion is very, very complicated, but there's one of the important practices for many Chinese homes, especially Han Chinese homes, is ancestral veneration, and that occurs through kinship, right? That's through sons honoring and their spouses, because it's patrilocal. So when a woman and a man get married, the woman comes in and lives with the man's family, and this is very dramatic. There's this like door slamming ceremony where it shows that she's left her old family behind, although she is still related to them. And then she moves in with the new family, and in that family, that sort of becomes her religious group now. In a sense, her veneration is towards her husband's ancestors, not her own ancestors. And so a religious system, as well as a land system and a property system for families where that would be applicable, like farming families, is very much structured through kinship, through family. So that's the idea then of a descent group, sort of a kinship group in which things are traced through this line of who's descended by to who. And that can be very, very powerful. So for example, with Hopi kinship, Hopi people traditionally, as I just said a moment ago, trace line through matrilineal, through mother's line, and that's where the cornfields, very, very important. Different fields would belong to different families, but also things like religious objects, as well as who was the political leader. It was through a specific clan, a specific household for the village. And so kinship matters. Kinship's very powerful. Now, there's a couple of terms I kind of want you to be vaguely aware of, which are lineage versus clan. These are from a different book that I used to use, but basically, you don't, just a very brief kind of, in case you hear these used in other contexts, especially up here in Alaska, it's not uncommon, for example, for people from certain Alaska Native groups, such as Tlingit people, to introduce themselves, especially in certain kinds of contexts, like to other Alaska Native people or other Tlingit people with clan identity. So just so you understand what the term clan means and how it's different from other terms, clan we usually think of as a very large group that's related to each other, that claims descent to a specific ancestor, but they may or may not have that like exactly charted out. And so that's the idea of a clan. A moiety is another term you sometimes hear, and that actually refers to like an entire, like if you cut the society in half and you kind of have two, I hate to use the term mega clan, but that's kind of what's going on. And in a moiety, people sort of marry out to the other group. And so, for example, classically in Tlingit society, you had eagle or wolf moiety and raven moiety. So two different halves to the society that married into each other. So when it was time for you to marry as a raven person, you would go and marry somebody from eagle, or vice versa. And those were also the groups. They were very important for other purposes as well, these related groups, these groups of relatives called moieties, because they would also do things like hold potlatches together or honor the other moiety when the other moiety had lost somebody, or things like this. And on the sad occasion that there were conflicts, they were usually between clan groups. And so kinship was sort of this, or clans and moieties were this very important thing, and are still this important thing for Tlingit people. And that's true for many Native societies. That's certainly the case for where I work in the American Southwest with the Navajo. It's very common for people to introduce themselves by their clan, and if you're being really proper about it, you're also supposed to marry outside of your clan. I could also talk briefly about the fact that societies vary in terms of classification systems, and what that means is we have different ways of referring to the people we're related to. And you're like, yeah, sure, it's uncle in English and it's Tio in Spanish. That's not what I mean. I don't mean that. What I mean is that societies, even if you translated it all into English, have dramatically different ways of referring to your relatives. So for example, in the system that this is describing classic Hawaiian kinship prior to colonialism, it would be common to refer to all of your uncles on both sides as father, the term that would translate to father, and it would be common to refer to all of your aunts, as well as your mother, as mother. All women of the generation up from you get referred to as mother. In other societies, that might be just one half or the other. Some societies distinguish between cross cousins and parallel cousins. So cousins that you're related to through your dad's brother would not be somebody you're supposed to marry. That would be your parallel cousin. But people that are related to you through your dad's sister would be your cross cousin, and you are allowed to marry them, and even perhaps encouraged to marry them in some societies. And that goes the other way as well. So societies have different ways of classifying who's related to who and what we call those people. Okay, so question. Does any of this stuff actually matter, or are anthropologists just being freaking annoying nerds? And, that's not necessarily mutually exclusive. This could both matter and be anthropologists being nerds. Well, let me share with you one example of how things like variations in kinship terms, or variations in how cousins get called, or variations in descent groups. Let me share with you one example of kinship really mattering in a really practical way. And to do that, let's talk about the Pashtun. So the Pashtun are an ethnic group found in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, and a little bit in Turkmenistan. I am not Pashtun, and so if any Pashtun people are listening to this and I explain this poorly, I apologize and would love to be corrected, but please allow me to explain it to the best of my ability. The Pashtun people have what we call in anthropology a segmentary kinship system. What that means here. Let me just draw it for you. This is a pretty bad drawing, but it's going to work for the time being. This is your group that you're related to, this little branch, the people that you're most directly related to. And you might even be in a rivalry relationship with these people over here. But let's say that somebody over here does something to offend you two. Maybe there's a trade dispute, maybe there's an actual conflict, physical conflict of some sort. These two groups then lump together and are regarded as sort of an operating unit vis-a-vis this group. Does that make sense? So it's sort of it's a Lego kinship system, so to speak. You're putting the blocks together, or maybe a Russian doll might be a better metaphor. But then this group, which might be in conflict with each other significantly, might then, let's say somebody over here that's their sort of more distant cousins was to do something offensive or be in a trade dispute or steal something from them. This whole group sort of regards itself as related to each other in opposition to this one, and this one in opposition to that one. But then, of course, if an outsider comes by, this whole super extended kinship system, maybe we're talking thousands of people at this point, sort of become one mega clan vis-a-vis this outside group. Which, now you've got a big mess on that slide. My point with that, and why that matters on a practical level, is it's one of many reasons that helps explain why Afghanistan has never really been successfully occupied for a very long time by foreign outside forces. And so I'm thinking here, of course, early on in terms of the British, but I'm also thinking of the USSR's invasion in the 1980s, or rather we should say attempted invasion. And there was a number of reasons that didn't work, not the least of which was US assistance, but that was also because of the segmentary kinship system. So a society that looked like there was a lot of infighting and that it should be easy to conquer that portion, at least of Afghanistan, once faced with an outside force, kinship groups that had been previously engaging in sort of segmentary conflicts, maybe even warfare in some cases, were able to quickly unite together through the kinship system and oppose the outsiders, who of course aren't very closely related at all. You may be in conflict with this other group, your distant cousins, but hey, we're all united against the people that aren't related to us at all. We're a clan in the face of them. And that is also one of the many reasons, and I want to speak here sort of sensitively here because I know some folks have potentially been to Afghanistan in this audience, but that is one of the many reasons that Afghanistan has been a difficult area to be controlled by the U.S. military and later by Afghani government forces. So because there's such sort of, the segmentary kinship system sort of implicitly allows for shifting political alliances that sort of at one moment are one thing and at another moment are another, because the kinship group can get put together like a Russian doll and then break apart just as quick as the need may be. So kinship matters. Kinship also matters, for example, with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a Native American confederacy of 5 nations that traditionally controlled most of New York State, at least most of upstate New York State, and which was structured according to, as I mentioned before, each nation had clan members in each other nation. They married out to different clans, and so you eventually had, for example, Turtle Clan people in all 5 nations, which was one of many things that allowed these 5 nations not to go to war, because, sort of everybody was related to everybody. You had relatives on the other side. And so it's not always the case that relatives don't go to war. Indeed, Bhagavad Gita, the holy book of Hinduism, is all about sort of cousins having to go to war with each other, distant relatives. And indeed, the U.S. Civil War, brothers on both sides. But generally speaking, that reduces the likelihood of war, and that's certainly one of the reasons why the 5-nation confederacy worked so well for centuries and controlled such a vast territory of land, and indeed the political system was structured on sort of a kinship context. You don't really need to know these terms. We're just going to skip there.